In my opinion, drums are one of the most challenging and complicated instruments to mix because typically you're dealing with a whole bunch of different mics on the same instrument. So you have to worry about things like phase, you have to worry about submixing, and figuring out how to process them so they all work together and sound like one cohesive instrument. And one of the main tools that I use to bring a lot of impact and energy to drums is parallel processing. So I'm going to explain how and why I use parallel processing on drums. All right, so first I want to walk through kind of how things are routed so you can understand the signal flow. Drums dry is essentially, it's pretty much the main drum bus in a way because that's where all of these microphones are going. I have my kick microphone submixed to a bus, snare to a bus, but then all of those are feeding into this kind of dry bus here. So that's pretty much giving you a full picture of the drum kit. And then below here, I have a drum crush bus and a drum distort bus. And so the way that I set this up is instead of sending from this bus to compression and distortion, which I totally could do down here, what I'm doing instead is actually sending from the individual tracks and buses so that I can control the blend a little bit differently. So this is my main drum blend, but for compression and distortion, I often find it helpful to send less kick drum because all of that low end can really overpower the distortion or the compression. And then also less overheads because I don't want the cymbals to get too kind of crazy, fizzy, distorted, or I don't want them pumping with the kick too much. So sending less overheads can be really helpful. So then I end up basically with 3 buses that I'm blending between to get my sound. So I have kind of my main drum sound, and then I'm bringing in the compression and distortion to taste, essentially, just to find a balance that feels good, that adds the right amount of energy and impact. So now let's zoom in on parallel compression. So parallel compression is an often talked about technique. Essentially, you're just doing a ton of compression and then blending it with the same signal with no compression. And that just gives you kind of the best of both worlds. You can get the sustain and the dynamic control without completely obliterating and changing the transients. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying to get a lot of thickness out of the drums. I'm trying to just make them feel more solid and exciting. And so one of my favorite tools for that is the 1176. And so I'll use either my hardware one or this plugin. And I'm typically doing either all buttons in, or you can hold shift and do just 8 and 4. And that's a cool sound too. You can also do any combo of these buttons, but essentially when you put multiple buttons in at once, it starts to make the compressor act a little bit, crazier. You get more distortion, you get a lot more pumping, and it just adds a cool character to it. So before I keep talking, let's just hear how this sounds. So it adds a really cool splat to the snare, and the kick stays tight, but you just get that like longer sustain in the kick drum. And so I really like that. Another way you can approach parallel compression is to do something that adds a little bit more attack. So if you're feeling like you want your drums to sound more aggressive, you could use something like a DBX 160 that has a really pointed attack. But for this is kind of my go-to. I usually am wanting to add that sense of thickness to my drum sound. Another one that can be cool is Devil Lock from Sound Toys, but that's the compression. So essentially what I would do is play this back and then start at 0 and kind of bring it into taste. So you can hear it without, and then I'll bring it in. So it just gives the snare and the kick more authority and just kind of fills it out a little bit more, which I really like. And then another thing that really helps add character is distortion in parallel. And so this is something I love to do with Decapitator, but another fun thing you can do is actually send it to like a guitar pedal. Like the Rat is like perfect for this because you have that high-end filter. The main thing is you want to create a ton of distortion, but then tame some of that really high buzzy distortion. And so Devil-Lock's great for that because you have these built-in filters. So let's hear how the drum distortion sounds on its own. So it just sounds like the snare and the kick are just exploding the amount of distortion there. Kind of obliterates it, but when you blend that in, it really just makes the mid-range a lot thicker and adds this really cool impact and energy to the drums. And so what I've done here is essentially, I brought back the tone a little bit just to make it slightly darker, and then the high cut and low cut a little bit, which affects how it distorts. And these are really gentle filters, so it doesn't affect the phase too negatively. Because one thing you might think as soon as you start using filters is like you're going to run into phase issues blending that with the original source. But when you're distorting something this heavily, that's actually less of a concern because you're adding so much to the signal that it is changing the waveforms and the phase relationships anyway. So you really just can mess around with it and blend it to taste so that it's a little bit more of a mid-range focused distortion. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll play back the drums and then bring it in. So yeah, it doesn't take much. I just want to like feel the impact of it. I'm not looking to hear the audible distortion. So I'll play this back muted and then bring it in. And then I'm gonna play back this whole drum bus. I'm gonna mute the parallel buses and then bring them in again. So yeah, when I mute them, you immediately lose all this energy and impact in the snare, especially, and the kick drum. And that really helps it to cut through the mix. I find these really helpful. Even if I'm mixing drums that aren't in, indie rock where it needs to be a little bit more forward, I still use this even if I'm mixing like folk music or other stuff like that. I just will use even less until it feels like, I'm getting enough energy without overpowering the drums. So that's kind of the great thing about this technique is you can really just blend these three faders to find the combination of flavors that you like. But it's almost always useful to have some parallel compression and distortion somewhere in the mix, I find. All of that sums to a main drum bus where I'm doing further processing, but this is really where a lot of the character is coming from. So definitely highly recommend checking that out, using parallel buses. Let me know if you have any further questions about kind of what I used in the mix here, and I'd be happy to answer them in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.